Hello and welcome to Addis Matters, our show on Ethiopian current affairs with me, Begna Simesso. Defying the federal government's call to delay the election, the Tigray regional government went ahead with its plan and conducted regional election on September 9, 2020. Since the election, the rift between the federal government in one hand and Tigray regional government on the other is widening, and the situation seems to be escalating day by day. Where are we heading? I have two guests to discuss the ongoing confrontations between the federal government and Tigray region. Davison, senior Ethiopian analyst at the Crisis Group and founding editor of Ethiopia Insight, and Biruk Abdu, senior editor at the English Weekly Reporter. Thank you both for your time, views, and insights, and welcome to the show. A lot has happened since September 9, the election day in Tigray. The new assembly had elected Dr. Davison, president of the region, and the state had been officially formed in Tigray. William, let me start with you with post-election developments. Briefly, it feels like September 9 is ages ago now. What are the major developments in the last 3-4 weeks?
Well, as you know, there's been several developments, but I think the most, possibly the most consequential are these budgetary measures that we've seen. So a decision from the House of Federation, or a recommendation that the federal government will stop the transfers to Tigray regional state. And they've put that in the form of not delivering the federal subsidy to this sort of executive of Tigray's government, so the state council and the cabinet, because they say that those elements are unconstitutional, and instead they're going to try and direct federal funding towards the lower levels of Tigray's government, towards the Waradas and possibly the Kebele administrations. I'm not sure how practical that plan is. This is hugely significant because the TPLF politicians, the Tigray leadership, have described these types of punitive fiscal measures as tantamount to a declaration of war. So we can obviously see how serious that is. And then in response, the Tigray leadership has said that they are considering or planning to withhold the tax revenues that they collect on behalf of the federal government as a sort of tit-for-tat measure. So these are incredibly serious developments. And maybe they will play out with a series of maneuvers, but it really does look like a worrying escalation.
The budget cut from the federal government will have significant impact, as you said. But there have been, we've heard reports coming out from Tigray, especially from people who are very close to the TPLF. Last year, for instance, the Tigray regional state collected about 7 billion birr in tax revenue for the federal government, which is poured into the federal treasury. They claim to retain that tax revenue. The federal subsidy they are getting this year is about 10 billion birr. The difference seems to be very small. So do you think it will have that much of an impact, the budget cut, if Tigray maintains to keep the federal tax?
Yeah, that's my understanding too. I think I understood it to be sort of 9 billion in federal subsidy and something like 8 billion that the regional government collects on behalf of the federal government. So on paper, theoretically, there's some sort of balance there where Tigray can retain these revenues and make up for the shortfall in the federal subsidy, but that's entirely theoretical. This is a political dispute. How do we think that the federal government would respond, for example, if a regional state is simply withholding revenues that are, by law, federal revenues? And of course, this is on top of Tigray's government saying that it's absolutely illegal for the federal government to withhold the subsidy from a member of the federation. So we can see some, comparable revenues there, as you described, but it's the politics of this which is going to overtake those sorts of considerations and lead us, as we've discussed, potentially towards escalation.
Absolutely. Biruk, would you like to add anything on the post-election developments in Tigray?
Well, thank you very much. For me, the main development in this, as William said, is the decision by the House of the Federation to sever its ties with the federal government's ties with the Tigrayan government, and the other one is the budget cut, that is the budget subsidy cut. Well, the intention of budget subsidy by its concept is to distribute resources across the nation and balance development throughout the country. So the decision by itself is not going to directly affect Tigray region or the people, because the federal government said that it's going to distribute the budget through the other channels like the Woreda and the Kabali administrations. Therefore, we can't say that the federal government is going to totally cut its budget subsidies to the Tigray regional government. But the other thing is, these decisions.
But there are questions on the practicality of channeling fund to the smallest administration units like the Kabalis and the Weredas.
Yes, you're right. So there are some kind of theories that people have been presenting to the society. For example, like some experts have been saying that the federal government can set up its own institutions in the regional government and distribute its funds, but practicality of this also is questionable. But actually, in practice, the decisions are not going to be directly implemented on the ground, because the ties are not going to be cut totally with the regional government, because the ties that the House of the Federation said to be cut is only with the regional council and the instituted government of the Tigray regional government. So when we see the practicality of these decisions, we can say that they are not applicable.
I think in the last days, of course, the budget has dominated the discussion, but to sum up, the escalation on both sides of delegitimizing each other had been going on for weeks. The federal government's call via the Speaker of the House of Federation for the suspension of the Assembly, for the establishment of a transitional government at regional level in Tigray, or the intervention of even the possibility of the intervention of security forces. The Tigray state, on the other hand, through the Intergovernmental Relations Office, which is sort of a foreign affairs office, some people are saying, had called for the formation of a technocratic caretaker government to run the bureaucracy at the federal level. And we know that it has pulled TPLF members of the parliament from the House of People's Representatives and the House of Federations. But most importantly, laws, regulations, and directives coming out of the federal government will not be enforced in Tigray. This is a huge revolt, William, don't you think so?
Yes, I think it's a very serious dispute. I think the phrase mutual legitimization is a good one for describing what's happened here over the last few months. That emanates from a very long-lasting political dispute within the former ruling coalition. Over the course of the transition, that has got increasingly bitter. That led to this very serious constitutional dispute over the legitimacy of delaying elections and extending government's terms. That's what's led us to where we are. And I don't think that coming in at this point, with all that sort of history of deterioration in relations, I don't think we can sort of enter this situation now and try and find a resolution. Instead, we sort of have to rewind back to look at what the origins of the dispute are, to try and find a way out of this. Because at the moment, it's not obvious what the negotiated solution is. So that the TPLF, for example, has embraced the idea of dialogue, but the preconditions that it's putting in place for dialogue in terms of that technocratic caretaker government, I mean, that's not practical. That's not going to happen. So a lot of things need to fall into place first before we can start to see some sort of viable negotiated solution here.
Yeah. Biruk, you mentioned about the practicality of the federal government's budget cuts and cutting relationships with the Tigray Regional Assembly. My understanding is the relationship is cut between the federal government and the regional assembly, as well as the regional executive branch of the government. But we have seen some reports coming out this week, for instance. The Ministry of Education is distributing face masks to schools across the country. And initially there were reports coming out that Tigray region was not included in that plan. But then the ministry amended, saying it had planned to distribute more than 2 million or 2.5 million face masks to schools in Tigray. But we are already witnessing they don't find ways of distributing these masks to the school kids, and the people of Tigray seems to be starting to pay the price.
Well, I don't agree with that conclusion. Actually, paying the price is not showing itself. But the thing is, as I've said, the budget subsidies, in principle, they are meant to distribute development in this country. So, in practice, the government cannot do that, because if it does, it's affecting the development of that region. Therefore, it will stand against the principle of budget subsidies and distribution of resources. Therefore, the government is not going to do that. And the distribution of face masks is directly related to social welfare and general health of the students. So the federal government has decided for the students to go to school. Therefore, the preconditions, one of the preconditions to let our children go to school is letting them wear face masks. So one of the providers of these face masks is the Federal Ministry of Education, and it's actually doing the distribution. So the thing is,
they're not in Tigray yet.
Well, they have allocated, but when we see it,
they couldn't find ways of doing that. I mean, the federal government doing it to each school in the region.
Well, that's not feasible, actually. That's not feasible. They can't do that, actually. They can send the face masks to the Education Bureau of the regional government, and the regional government can distribute according to the number of schools and the number of students in every zones and wards in the regional government. So that's how they can.
But the problem is, they say they cannot have that relationship with the regional government, so it's going to be some sort of vicious circle. The problem is, I mean, we are on the first week of this decision, we are seeing a kind of the glimpse of the situation getting worse. William, you said let's get to the bottom line, the cause for the rift. Can we say the cause for the conflict is ideological, or is it an organizational one, a party structure of the Prosperity Party moving away from multi-ethnic structure of EPRDF into a more united national party? Or is it probably in relation to the ideology of EPRDF, the former coalition which follows revolutionary democracy? PP, on the other hand, claims to have this ideology of Mademer or synergy or coming togetherness, or the economic policy. The TPLF-led EPRDF used to believe in developmental state economic approach where the state should play a prominent role in the economy of the country. Or is this just loss of power by TPLF, loss of the upper hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to this other issue and how that fits into what seems to be the federal government strategy here. And we can talk about what seems to be the TPLF strategy as well. But it's fairly obvious that the federal government wants to make clear distinctions between the TPLF and the region and the people. Even within the TPLF, people want to talk about, a few TPLF elites or old guard who are the problem, and focus this sort of energy and the complaints and the punitive measures. But that really raises the question, well, is it just a question of a few TPLF elites, or is the broader support for the Tigrayan position? And of course, we can see this through the efforts to direct funding towards the lower tiers of Tigray's regional administration, excluding the top elected tiers. Is that practical? Is it really possible, to draw those distinctions and make those divisions within Tigray? And I think, the success of the federal government strategy depends upon that. And then there's also lots of question marks about the TPLF strategy. But to get to your question, I think clearly there's a number of factors that are playing into this, and all of them significantly interlinked. At the root of this, I would say, is the TPLF's preeminence within the former ruling coalition, the EPRDF, those decades when it was the main architect of this system, and then held considerable power, not just in Tigray, but within the federal government, within the security apparatus, and within the military. That obviously led, one way or another, to the changes that we saw in 2018. That was a formal loss of TPLF power we saw then, but then we also saw the prosecutions of TPLF officials. We saw the high-profile allegations of corruption during the EPRDF era directed at Tigrayan officials from Metek and this type of thing. Generally, all of Ethiopia's problems, or a lot of them, blamed upon the TPLF and the sort of security apparatus and the authoritarian system that it ran as it was perceived by its opponents. Now, this led not just to a loss of power for the TPLF, but also to a very increasingly bitter relations between the parties. TPLF maybe was accepting that they lost power and it was time for others to have more power, but being blamed for all of Ethiopia's problems was something that really worsened the political relations there. Now, I think that fed into these more sort of ideological political disputes relating to the allegations that the Prime Minister and the Prosperity Party are looking to undo the multinational federal system that the TPLF set up. If those political relations were not so bitter, resulting from the transition in the decades of TPLF predominance, then maybe there wouldn't be such extreme allegations coming from the TPLF about the Prime Minister's intentions. So I think they're all bundled up together, and of course this has culminated in this very, very stark constitutional dispute, as we discussed. I think the political problems are resolvable, but unless people find a way of being more accommodating and less rigid on their positions, these constitutional legal positions, then again it's kind of hard to see a negotiated way out of this at the moment.
Biruk, it's obvious that TPLF has lost power, but for the last 2.5 years, it was running Tigray almost independently, unilaterally, and the federal government used to have more of a softer approach to it. I mean, the regional government conducted election, for instance. They declared the state of emergency before the federal government. They repeatedly have written to foreign governments, international organizations, beyond their constitutional mandate. What's Tigray's interest in this? I mean, TPLF's interest in this, rather. They are managing Tigray. Why do they want to interfere in the affairs of other parts of the country?
Well, some of the reasons that I can mention, one of the reasons is that what William said, that they have already lost power in the federal government's affairs, so they want to reassert themselves that Ethiopia was better off when they were in power. So that was, I think that's the main thing. But announcing the state of emergency before the federal government does, it's actually in their constitution, and they can do that, and it's in the mandates of the regional government. So any regional government can announce a state of emergency whenever they notice that there is a condition for that situation. But when we come to holding election while the federal government has decided to not hold elections because of the global coronavirus pandemic, so that clearly shows that the TPLF and the Tigrayan government in general want to stand against the federal government, and they really want to delegitimize the federal government, and they don't actually want it to smoothly do what it wants, because they are the strongest opponent or opposition group in this country that stand against the Prosperity Party that's leading the rest of the country, I can say. So their interest in this is, so they want to assert themselves as legal and legitimate regional leaders there, and the federal government is not constitutional and it's not legitimate leader of the rest of the country. So they want to present the rest of the country as lacking legitimate government and legitimate leaders that were not elected, that are not elected by the people. Yeah. So that's in the interest of the two.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that and build on my answer, I think if we look at this sort of dispute over the constitution and the federal system, whilst the federal government and Prosperity Party is formally committed to the multinational federation that TPLF holds so dearly, ultimately the transition that we've seen in Ethiopia has meant the empowering of political forces, political constituencies, which are absolutely opposed to that system. They have been opposed to it for decades. They think that it's driving Ethiopians apart. They think that the system was purely instituted by the TPLF as a divide and rule mechanism. So my point is that, whilst the TPLF's allegations against Prosperity Party and the Prime Minister for wanting to reintroduce a unitary state or whatever it may be, whilst they may seem exaggerated, it is also understandable that they have concerns that these political forces, which are completely opposed to multinational federalism, have been empowered during this transition. And I think that is also part of these very serious political problems we have.
The Prosperity Party, of course, defends that. I mean, it claims to be a multinational party, although it's structured as a national party. Let's review the election. When we discussed the issue of Tigray back in June, William, I remember you said the election in Tigray could be a repeat of the 2010 or the 2015 election at the federal level will happen at the regional level. And basically that's what has just happened. 98.2% of the vote went to the ruling party, TPLF. My question is, to get to such result, was the election really worth fighting for? What's the point of having an election? I mean, to just get an approval note.
Well, I think, as we know, I mean, the election was based upon constitutional principles, particular interpretation of the constitution as viewed from Tigray. That is that there is no facility to delay the election beyond the constitutional term limits of the governments. Therefore, it was absolutely imperative to remain within the constitutional order to hold the election. That was the purpose of the election. Of course, there's the renewal of a popular mandate that comes with an election. That's also part of the calculations. And then in terms of the result, I mean, I don't know. I was prevented from traveling to Mekelle. Not that I was going to be an official election observer or even a reporter, but I mean, I think the broader point there is there wasn't a great deal of independent scrutiny of the election. But then we can also see some of these important political dynamics which may well have contributed to a very big vote for the TPLF. And that's this growth of Tigrayan solidarity with many Tigrayan people, not just elites, feeling that the region has been unfairly blamed for various problems and that there are major security threats to Tigray. Now, given the TPLF's security focus and its long control of Tigray, with those dynamics, it makes sense for people to vote for the TPLF, even if they don't agree with every aspect of the TPLF's rule and policy. Then we also have the fact that the opposition parties only had a limited amount of time to campaign and mobilize for this election. That may have reduced their turnout. And then there's the TPLF, and it's embedded with the government there, and therefore its control over the system. That may well have also contributed to this overwhelming victory.
Yeah, I think it's understandable. I mean, TPLF has a very historic and long-term relationship with the people of Tigray. The Tigrayans paid for the cost of TPLF on personal level, at family level. So, but as you said, there was no proper independent scrutiny about the result. Well, pre-election campaigns were relatively positive, the reports coming out from the region. After the election, some of the parties who took part in the election, such as Baitona and Salsa Wayane, for instance, had claimed repression. Biruk, but on the positive side, election is not a bad thing. It's a democratic exercise, isn't it? We have learned through the Tigrayan experience that we can have election even under a pandemic. Maybe some lessons could be get out of the Tigrayans election process. Is there something that we could take out of the Tigrayan election at the federal level?
Well, as you've said, holding an election is what everybody that stands for democratic process stands for. So, but the question is, why do we hold elections, and why do we give the people to vote for their leaders? So if all the voices and all the opinions and the views of the public are not represented in the results of the election, that election is useless after all. So that's why the last election of the federal government's parliament is repeatedly criticized for. So I think that the result of the Tigrayan election, to some extent, even though it was not unexpected, I think it shocked TPLF, and that's why they again amended the constitution to include non-voting members of the opposition to have seats in the parliament. So that was a disaster to some extent for the TPLF, the result. So for me, a lesson is that as I've always been saying, that the people in Tigray, they're always active participants in their community affairs, and they're more of active when it comes to democratic processes and so on. And that's why I can say that almost 80-90% of the Tigrayans, they support TPLF, and because they know TPLF in and out. So they understand the politics, they understand what it stands for. So although there are no other political parties that can instill their thoughts and other things in the other policies and their ideologies in the public, so the positive aspect of this election for me is that it's going to create an awareness among the people that fighting for an election is worth, even though we can argue on the results that came out of that election.
I think this is an interesting area to focus on. You know, we've discussed all the problems of the election because of this very serious legal constitutional dispute between the federal and Tigray's government. But if we sort of zoom out a bit and look at the Ethiopian Federation overall and its sort of democratic development, we know that we've had sort of what's called was often called a de facto one-party state throughout the federation. The EPRDF entirely controlled the country's politics. They ran not just the federal parliament, but every regional state council, and they also completely dominated at lower levels. Now that the EPRDF is no more, and we're expecting a transition to multi-party democracy, with that would be some form of political pluralism within the federation. So you have different political parties in power and different regional chambers and in the federal government. So if we forget about this legal dispute for a moment, this regional election that we've seen in Tigray is one of the more vibrant and dynamic democratic exercises that we've seen in Ethiopia. Of course, it's not perfect, as we can see from the result. Some opposition parties boycotted because they said that the TPLF had a repressive control of politics in Tigray. But we have seen a debate. We've seen new parties with new ideas. We've seen a huge turnout. We've just seen an increased public focus on the fact of a regional election. So if we can, for the moment, ignore this very serious legal and political dispute, that is actually, elements of that are a sort of positive democratic development for the Federation, and something which almost inevitably we're going to have to see more of in the years to come because of this breakup of this all-dominant ruling coalition.
Interesting. The response given from the federal government, I mean, the last few days had been very, very repressive, but for weeks and probably for months, the response from the federal was more of like a mixed signal, isn't it? Verbal provocations continued, but little action seems to embolden the Tigrayan hardliner approach. The federal government seems to be patient for so long, soft power approach. The prime minister even once said, for 1 year, even TPLF's term is extended with the Constitutional Review Council and the House of Federation's ruling. But later on he said, things like Charaba Mercha, which was not very accepted favorably by Tigrayans in particular, because, as you said, there was a huge turnout, more than 2.7 million people turned out to vote. But there are sharp criticisms coming out of other federal authorities, such as the Speaker of the House of Federations and some officials like the Oromia President Shimellis Abdisa. But recently we heard from Moferiat Kamil, the peace minister, who called for calm on both sides in her recent interview with ETV. A lot has been said about to resolve the situation through peaceful dialogue. Biruk, what's the way out? What should be done?
Well, I think it's not an easy endeavor to give directions, to give easy directions to get out of this quagmire that we're seeing in this country. So the tension between TPLF and the federal government has worsened the tension and the worsened the political landscape in this country, and we're seeing that. So all political forces in this country are focused on this, and even the government's energy is directly focused on this problem with the Tigrayan government. So the same thing applies to the Tigrayan government and officials in the TPLF. So that shows that we have to get out of this thing as soon as possible. So the way out of this is, as everybody has been saying, is sitting around the table and discussing what the differences are, and to come to the terms among themselves. So they have to find a middle ground that they can really talk about their problems, and they can at least agree on their differences, and they can frame some kind of way out to this problem. So the main thing is discussion. So the other thing is to stop the provocations from both sides. For example, the federal government and the Tigrayan government, both of them, they have been showing military parades, and they also the federal government also boasts of having that kind of power to quash any kind of violence that comes against the constitution and the power in the federal government. And the Tigrayan government and the officials in the TPLF are saying the same thing. So they have to de-escalate the issue by letting these kinds of things go. So these are the main points, I think, that can get us out of this.
William, building on this question,
Yeah.
you once proposed with the report from the crisis group, I think back in June or July, the AU mediation. You call for AU mediation or South African mediation?
Yes, of some form of external mediation.
Yeah, external, foreign intervention. Do you still stand by those propositions?
Yeah, I just want to talk about the response of the federal government to this situation. I see the House of Federation as being very prominent in that. This is a constitutional dispute. That's what's led us to this current crisis, and the House of Federation is mandated to deal with that. Now, this means that the House of Federation sort of almost inevitably has to make quite a legalistic response, because the Tigray's government is just going straight up against these federal rulings. Now, we also have these other reactions that you've talked about. The Prime Minister's adopted somewhat hawkish tones at times, other times slightly dovish tones. And then we have the interventions from the Peace Minister, Muferiat. I think given like how high the stakes are, that's hardly surprising. You know, either people are looking for some form of negotiated solution, or they're pursuing this sort of legalistic approach, which does seem to lead us down the path of confrontation and ultimately potentially civil war. So you can understand that the people are searching around for different solutions here. Now, what Crisis Group did prior to the election in August is realize just how serious this situation was. Now, some of the recommendations that we made, for example, for Tigray to pause the election, should the federal government be willing to hold talks, absolutely rejected in Tigray. The idea of external mediation, absolutely rejected by the federal government. This is an internal matter, we're a sovereign state. Now, everyone understands these positions, but because the political stakes are so high, we do have to think about creative, sort of out-of-the-box solutions here. So, like, everyone understands broadly understands the politics, the toxic politics that's underlying the dispute, and then the constitutional disagreement. But if we continue down that trajectory, the country is going down the path of conflict. So we do have to look at extraordinary solutions. I and Crisis Group are not saying that has to involve external mediation, but it has to involve something other than what we're seeing right now. I think, what Biruk was talking about was excellent in terms of people reducing the rhetoric, this destabilizing, provocative rhetoric. I would also look at the preconditions that have been in place now. I think that, yes, okay, we understand the Tigrayan position on the legitimacy of the federal government, but really it's paramount to have some form of bilateral some form of negotiations here. So it would be great to see the TPLF drop some of those preconditions about a caretaker government and agree to enter talks, because things are so serious. And then on the federal government side, yes, legally they have classified Tigray's leadership, Tigray's government as unlawful, but that should not stop them trying to open channels to Tigray's leadership, to the TPLF leadership, so that they can have some form of discussions. Those sorts of creative political approaches are needed because the consequences otherwise are so dire.
It's interesting that William you've softened your stand on the intervention of a foreign negotiator in this, because the crisis group's recommendation in the report was very strong that Ethiopia really needs a foreign intervention. That's, for example, the African Union is head and influential continental leaders like Cyril Ramaphosa and the European Unions too. But when these kinds of groups or external negotiators come, they come with interests. So that's going to also complicate the issues that we are already seeing in this country. So I'm afraid that an external negotiator can work in this country, but as he said, we need another mediators, or, for example, neutral people that we know from the academics, or that we know that they are in the middle because of their repeated narratives and so on. So those kinds of people we need, but external foreign negotiators, that's going to be a risk by itself.
I think it's just a last resort, though. Like, if we don't have this willingness to discuss directly, bilaterally, like if there's all these obstacles to this concept of a national dialogue, which is what the TPLF wants, and there are major obstacles to that, and also it's not clear that the political crisis is so urgent. How long is it going to take a national dialogue to come into place? If we're struggling to find somewhat neutral Ethiopian mediators, which have influence in the ear of both parties here, the federal leadership and the Tigrayan leadership, that's when we have to start thinking about external mediation. Of course, they come with interests, and it could raise all sorts of problems and all sorts of objections. But as I've said a few times, if the alternative is civil war, then I think these things have to be tried at some point.
I think in defense to the crisis group and William, when the report came out back in August, or July, lots of people were very critical of it, inviting in foreign mediators. But I think, to my understanding, there have been a number of initiatives. Do you remember the Peace Mothers trip to Mekelle, for instance? There were some groups of elders went to Mekelle as well, a couple of times. So it seems like what you proposed, like academicians or elders' involvement, had been tried and it kind of failed.
Well, in this, the problem is the approach, in my understanding. The approach, it's just a reconciliatory visits that we've seen, but it's not really touching the real problems that we're seeing between the two governments. That's the Tigray regional government and the federal government. So, for example, religious fathers, they might negotiate between two conflicting parties, and they might say that, so come in the middle and hug each other. But they can't really touch the real problem that we're seeing. So there's
superficial,
a problem.
You're
yes,
saying.
there is a problem in the approach. So if we really give attention to the approach, we can really solve this problem internally, I believe. But after all, we're not. We can't avoid external intervention in this issue, because they might, by their own interests, they might come and involve in the issue.
That's exactly right. This is not just about appeals. It's not just about appeals for compromise. We have to first, this fiscal sort of tit for tat measures has to be addressed so that we can have just a normal functioning of the federation. Then there needs to be some cooperation between the federal and Tigrayan leadership. If that's established, then the parties need to talk about the issue of elections and legitimacy, because obviously this is now at the core of the dispute. So it can't just be appeals for peace and compromise. These are hard political disputes with a constitutional basis to them. And that's what needs to be addressed through, ideally, direct negotiations.
Yeah. Beyond the negotiations between Tigray and the federal government, there had been a call for national dialogue, a more comprehensive and inclusive, because there are problems almost everywhere. In Oromia, we have heard recently the call from the OLF, the faction which is led by the OLF leader, Daud Ibsa, for a transitional government to be formed in Oromia, for instance. There are problems in other parts of the country as well. So lots of people had been calling for the national dialogue. So, William, don't you think it's rather better to have a more of inclusive national dialogue than to mediate between the federal government and the Tigray? Because it will probably solve just one bit of the problem rather than the whole national crisis.
Yes, but it's just a matter of urgency and therefore prioritization. So, if this Tigray federal dispute worsens and escalates to conflict, that's going to present a huge problem for Ethiopia overall, right? So it's just a question of what's the most urgent problem to deal with. That's not to say that there are not, a set of problems with deep roots that require a national dialogue. I believe that, Crisis Group has advocated for that. More importantly, a whole swathe of Ethiopian political actors and non-political actors, including the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, have called for this. We've seen a degree of support from the government, from the Prime Minister, with the Ministry of Peace increasingly getting involved. There is momentum building for a national dialogue, and there are the problems to justify that. There are major obstacles, though. They are the participation of the TPLF, the Tigray leadership, because of the preconditions that they have set. They are the arrest and the ongoing trials of major Ethiopian political leaders, particularly the Oromo nationalist opposition, and the problem of public perception that creates in Oromia. And then less of a problem, but more something to be aware of, is to what extent does the government really support a fundamental, comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue that addresses all of Ethiopia's problems? Does the government and the federal government leadership, do they conceive of this national dialogue in the same way that the political opposition does? That's not absolutely clear. We see a certain amount of buy-in and support from the federal government, but personally, I think there is more to be understood about, just whether they are on the same page as the opposition.
All right, we are approaching an end. At the end, I would like to conclude with a question on foreign affairs and diplomatic issues. Biruk, the Minister of Foreign Affairs this week had briefed all diplomats, ambassadors in Addis about the ongoing situation, particularly on COVID-19 and related matters, on the delayed election and the issue with Tigray. The Tigray state, as I mentioned earlier, beyond its constitutional mandate, had been repeatedly writing for various governments and international organizations. The Eritrean president is in town, well, not in town, in country, basically. Where do you see, you suggested you are a bit against foreign intervention probably at this point of time, but the government is now engaged in diplomatic missions as well. What role can foreign partners play in these issues?
As you've said, I don't want to prescribe any kind of involvement by foreign forces to de-escalate the tension between the federal government and the Tigrayan government, as well as to resolve the differences that they have. My point here is, but this problem between the federal government and the Tigrayan regional government is going to have regional and foreign affairs aspects. So, for example, if you see Eritrean president is in the town, but can we really say that the Eritrean problem can be solved before the federal government? Can the federal government really implement the decision by the border commission to hand over Badme without resolving its problems with TPLF? That's a big question. So can it really create a good relationship with the Eritrean government before resolving its issues with TPLF? That's a big question. So it has regional and foreign affairs implications by itself. Therefore, these kinds of foreign partners can actually recommend some kinds of way outs from this problem that we're seeing between. Apart from this, I don't see any kind of role that foreign partners can play in the de-escalation and resolution of the problem between the federal government and the Tigray regional government.
William, similar question and concluding remark. The European Union Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Vice President was in town. He had met with officials, including the Prime Minister and the President. As I said, the Minister of Affairs was engaged in diplomatic briefing sessions this week, and the Eritrean President is paying a visit to Ethiopia. And Herman Cohen, the former U.S. Understate Secretary for Africa, who mediated back in the 1990s between the Derg government, the TPLF and EPLF, had tweeted a very controversial tweet yesterday saying Isaias's visit to Ethiopia is a message to TPLF not to try military actions. What do you think will be the Eritrean role in this, and what constructive role can foreign players play in this matter?
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot of pieces in play, clearly. Maybe if we just start with the tweet. I don't get that. The TPLF are aware of, obviously they're aware of their hostile relations with the Eritrean government and the president there, and also of his strong bilateral, his strong relations with the Ethiopian Prime Minister. There's nothing new there at all. So I'd have thought these calculations have already been made by the TPLF. Maybe just moving backwards, in terms of the visit of Josep Borrell from the European Union, I think my understanding is that there was a fairly strong message delivered there from Brussels that they are concerned about Ethiopia's political trajectory. I'm sure they're aware of the complexities and the difficult position that the Prime Minister has found himself in many ways, but ultimately the arrest of a bunch of opposition leaders, regardless of the circumstances, creates problems for Ethiopia's democratic advancement. And as we've discussed at length, this is a very dangerous situation between the federal government and Tigray. So we can understand the European Union expressing its concerns there. Now, to Brooks' point about President Isaias and the visit and the relationship with Abiy, well, this is absolutely key. We would want to see these types of bilateral visits and this strong relationship between the two leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea. But until there is some resolution, some easing of the crisis between Addis Ababa and Mekele and Asmara, well, we're going nowhere in terms of bilateral relations. We still have a militarized border. We don't have normal bilateral trade relations or a normal immigration regime. So really, the TPLF, the Tigray problem is at the root of enhancing those bilateral relations. Then also I think we can broaden this out a bit as well. We haven't really talked about it, but my understanding of part of the TPLF strategy here is that they think that the federal government is very weak and the Prime Minister isolated. Now that also seems to be the view of the Egyptian government. So when we look at the Nile dispute, there seems to be this sort of banking on Ethiopia's instability, both by the TPLF, but like I say, also by the Egyptian government. This is not a healthy state of affairs. We need everyone to work together here and to come to some sort of agreement rather than sort of waiting for Ethiopia's instability to worsen. And we can also bring Khartoum-Addis relations into this, which have seen something of a nosedive recently. And we've seen a flare-up of disputes on that disputed border. Is that coincidental? I don't think so, It looks like there is an effort again there to prod at Ethiopia's weakness. Now these weaknesses, whether it's in terms of disputed borders, the TPLF situation, or EMEA, other issues of internal instability, they absolutely exist. But the more that people prey on them, obviously Ethiopia's internal problems are probably going to worsen, and that's going to make it even harder to come to some form of peaceful resolution.
Very alarming situations. We'll keep an eye. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for watching. Thank you both for your contribution. William Davison, Senior Ethiopia Analyst at the Crisis Group and founding editor of Ethiopia Insight, and Biruk Abdu, Senior Editor at the English Weekly Reporter. Next time, we'll be back with another topics and another guest. Until then, goodbye from me, Begna Simesso, and the team at Addis Matters.